Hello, class. This is the Unit 2 supplemental lecture. I got some feedback from some of you from the Unit 1, and you seem to think these were helpful for preparing for the exams. Again, these are not comprehensive lectures like you get in a face-to-face class where I go over each chapter for an hour and 15 minutes or anything like that, but rather just I want to focus on some of the more difficult learning objectives from this unit. And there are a couple difficult ones, especially as you get up into chapter 10 with nation building, where we talk a little bit about constitutional theory. So let's go ahead and get started here. We're going to start with chapter 6 and learning objective 4 about Anne Hutchinson. And that learning objective asks how Anne Hutchinson could be seen as a natural trajectory of the Protestant Reformation. If you think of the Reformation as really simplifying things and taking the intermediary out between the congregations and their faith by getting rid of the Catholic Church, if you took that a step further, you could get rid of any church at all, even including a Protestant church. And that's what Anne Hutchinson was proposing to do in New England, was just to have informal Bible studies, and that you didn't really need a formal congregational church. And that really upset the social fabric of New England, because they were in effect running a theocracy where the church and state were combined. And so radicals like Anne Hutchinson or Roger Williams, who directly rebelled against this theocracy, they were cast out of New England, and in both cases thrown into Rhode Island. In Roger Williams' case, that's where he then brought the Baptist denomination over from England to America. And Anne Hutchinson's case, she later ended up dying. But both of them, I think, show the limits of the religious freedom of the Pilgrims, or especially the Puritans, really, who washed over the Pilgrims and took over New England. They were advocates of religious freedom insofar as they favored their own religious freedom, but they really did not tolerate others, whether it be dissenters or rebels like Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams, or Quakers or Baptists or Catholics or anything of that nature. I want to skip up to chapter 7 then on the Enlightenment and Great Awakening and talk about a concept toward the end of that chapter where we talk about church-state relations and how they developed in America. And there's a little bit of a mystery there with this. This is a reenactment of the Mammoth cheese present that the Baptists of Cheshire, Massachusetts gave to President Thomas Jefferson. And it's a little bit of a mystery why Baptists of all denominations would be so in favor of Thomas Jefferson or thanking him for his role on religion. And the mystery there, I think, is solved by the fact, or explained by the fact, that Thomas Jefferson was a strong advocate of church-state separation. He was a strict separationist. His friend James Madison had drawn up the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and Madison had drawn up the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom before that, which was the most full-blown expression of religious freedom in the entire Western world up until that time. Granted complete religious liberty and no taxes demanded of anybody to be paid into an established church. Today, we tend to look at people who favor strong church-state separation as being anti-religious or against religion, but really this favored American religion. This is what allowed a wide variety of religions to flourish in the United States. And what these Baptists were doing was thanking Jefferson for the fact that he was protecting them from the dominant religion in their region of New England, which was the Congregational Church. Another group of Baptists in New England, these from Danbury, Connecticut, they wrote Jefferson a thank you note for his role in strengthening the First Amendment. And in his reply to their letter, he used the word separation of church and state, which is then what later Supreme Court justices used to interpret the First Amendment. Madison also used that phrase to describe it, but the phrase church-state separation is not found actually in the First Amendment. Now, there's another learning objective just after those. Those are learning objectives 7.5 and 7.6. 7.7 asks, how is it that by legally keeping religion out of politics, the United States ended up with a stronger role of religion in politics? And it seems kind of ironic or unlikely at first, but I think that by creating this free marketplace of religious denominations where so many ideas were out there flourishing, then naturally people picked them up and started arguing with them and using them on both sides of many political debates that have religious elements to them. A good example in the 19th century that we're going to get to in this course is slavery. And religion was used on both sides of, or Christianity was used on both sides of the slavery debate, both for and against slavery. That might not have happened in a regular European country where there's an established church and everybody knows what it is, and the politicians just sort of ignore it and kind of take it for granted. And it doesn't really get infused into the political debates the way it did in the United States, which had a much more lively and diverse and free religious marketplace because of the fact that we had separated church and state. In Chapter 8, the Colonial Rebellion, I think the most difficult learning objective is probably learning objective 9. This is LO 8-9, in other words, which is talking about the legacy of the Declaration of Independence, because there are two modern ways of looking at the Declaration. You can sort of revere it and say, hey, this is our founding document, and I don't want to hear anything negative about it. And there's another way, a more critical way of looking at it, which is that, hey, these dead white males, these rich white guys, they were talking about their own freedom and their own equality and independence, and they were excluding everybody else, which they were. But there's, I think, a third way, a more constructive way to look at the Declaration of Independence. And that is that even though its intended audience was more limited in the 18th century, that the ideas in the Declaration really were used by other groups later, whether it be Harvey Milk, the first gay mayor of a U.S. city, Ho Chi Minh is in San Francisco before he was assassinated in the 1970s. Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the North Vietnamese in Vietnam, when he wrote up the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence, he basically copied the American Declaration of Independence, just changed a couple of words around. The students here at Tiananmen Square in Beijing in 1989, they were quoting from the Declaration of Independence. The Black Panthers in the 1960s quoted from the Declaration of Independence. The women's rights movement, as it kicked off in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848, they rewrote the Declaration and changed the words to all men and women are created equal. Martin Luther King, in his famous I Have a Dream speech in 1963 in Washington, he was not saying, hey, I got some crazy ideas here, that we've never had them in America, I want a complete revolution against what we're all about or anything like that. Instead, he quoted from the Declaration and said that the founding fathers had written a promissory note, or a check, in other words, and that check bounced. That check came back with insufficient funds. And so he was trying to fulfill the ideas of the Declaration even more, rather than rejecting the founding fathers, in other words. And this is what the historian Annette Gordon Reed meant when she said that Jefferson's idea of equality was not all inclusive, but it was transformative. And so other groups that he originally would have excluded in his mind from the ideas of the Declaration later picked up on these ideas and filled them out even more. So this Declaration, it ends up being a lot more influential internationally. The French Revolution, they quoted from the Declaration. All kinds of other groups have since. Much more inspirational than the Constitution itself, which noticeably doesn't use phrases like liberty or equality or anything like that. On the other hand, the Constitution is what created our government. That's the government we live under. whereas the Declaration of Independence did not. That just broke us away from Britain, but it did create a new country, but it didn't explain how that country was going to be run or what its political system would be like. That comes under the Constitution, which you get up in chapter 10. And I'm kind of skipping over chapter 9 on the war, the American Revolution, since our time is limited here, since I think that chapter is a lot more straightforward. A lot of the military chapters are a little bit more straightforward and don't require as much further explanation. But when we get up to the Constitution, I think one of the most confusing things is a lot of Americans probably think that the United States just broke away from a pure monarchy and then wanted to create a pure democracy. But Britain was not an absolutist monarchy. Britain had already invented republicanism. Britain had already had representative government with its parliament that shared power, with the monarchy. So those ideas of putting power in the hands of the people, those were already naturally there for colonial Americans. They had a lot of self-government, in fact, within the 13 colonies. But also, and this is where things get a little more confusing, the Founding Fathers did not intend to create a pure democracy. That sounds very strange to our ears. In fact, that term democracy and the idea that that's what we wanted really didn't become popular until the 20th century and the 21st century, especially after World War II. At the time, what they're looking to do is create kind of a balance between a pure democracy where everyone would have power, that they also feared this would also potentially be tyrannical. This would be the tyranny of the mob, whereas they also wanted to avoid a dictatorship or the tyranny of one as represented by an absolutist monarchy. What they were looking for was a representative government that you could call republicanism, with a small r, that is, whereby certain people had the right to vote, but then rather than voting on issues directly, they would vote for politicians. That's the representative part. And then these representatives would decide what to do. So you could kind of think of it as a spectrum here between more centralized authority and a stronger national government and a more decentralized version where there's more power at the state level. It's interesting in the United States that we decided to combine states with a government. So they share power in this federal system. We could have gone all the way in either direction. We could have just left the states as countries. That would have been more like Europe is today, although they do have the European Union, but it's still not really a country. Or we could have gone completely in the other direction and just had the United States and then maybe had a few administrative units, but the states wouldn't have had any power at all. So there's kind of a compromise here in the United States. There's a lot of argument over how that power should be distributed within the federal system. Should the states have more power? Should the national government have more power? And as what you're going to see when you get up into Unit 3, this is really what created the first party system, is this argument over how power was going to be distributed. Would it be more with a strong national government or more along the lines of states' rights? Now, there are other things that I want to talk about in this chapter that get a little bit confusing, and one of them is the Bill of Rights. This Bill of Right, I guess if you use the singular, that we're talking about here mainly is the Second Amendment. The Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments that were added to the Constitution really right away, before it really kicked in, or at least within the first year or two. And these are rights that Americans have in relation to the national government, individual liberties that are protected from encroachment by the national government. It's a little confusing because today we think of all of us as having these rights, and that no government, the national or state government, can infringe on these rights. But originally, it did not apply to states. In other words, any rule that you're thinking about, or any one of the bills of rights that you're thinking about, let's say freedom of religion, for instance, it meant that the national government could not infringe on your freedom of religion. It did not mean that your local state could not. That changed later with the addition of a 14th Amendment, which then incorporated the first amendments, the first 10 amendments, or at least most of the first 10 amendments. It incorporated them down to the state level, so that the way the 14th Amendment has been interpreted, and after 1868 is when that came around, is that now the U.S. government and the state of Texas cannot infringe on your religious liberty. So that kind of happened gradually with most of the first 10 amendments. The Second Amendment, by the way, was one of the last amendments to be incorporated at the national level. That didn't really come around officially until 2008, 2010, with a couple key Supreme Court rulings regarding gun rights. Gun rights are a very good example of where you want to pay attention to context. A lot of times we cherry pick what we want from history, and I think I see both pro-gun and anti-gun advocates just cherry picking things recklessly without any concern or genuine interest in what was actually going on at the end of the 18th century. But you have to understand, at the end of the 18th century, this idea of creating a national government really had the states back on their heels, and they really wanted to make sure to not throw all of the power over into the national government. Now, a key form of power is military power. So the idea that they were going to put the military at the national level rather than just at the state level, that seems totally natural for us. We just completely take that for granted, like that was inevitable. It is not inevitable. There's a major, major argument over that, because who has the guns has the real power. Mao Zedong in the 20th century said, if you want to understand power, look down the barrel of a gun. So having the national government have the right to maintain a military, this was a very big deal. And one of the key things that came up then in the Bill of Rights was that the states were going to maintain militias. These militias had been very active in the American Revolution and a big part of the victory over Britain. But after the United States was created, the purpose of these militias initially was sort of to maintain a balance of power between the states and the national government. That is the context of the Second Amendment. It has to do with militias. That's why the word militia is in the Second Amendment. So the question then is, did it also include individual rights? Did it concern the rights of individuals to own guns? And there's been so much argument over that over the years. One of the interesting things, and we're talking about Learning Objective 10.9 here, is that you might think of the southern United States as an area that's probably been always very in favor of the individual gun right interpretation of the Second Amendment. Not the case. They, in the 19th century, favored the militia interpretation, the collective rights interpretation of the Second Amendment much more. Why? Because they wanted to maintain more power at the state level. These state militias in the South are what formed the Confederacy, for instance, during the Civil War. And so if the North wanted to weaken the power of those southern state militias, especially after the Civil War, it's really northern judges who invented the idea of the individual rights interpretation of the Second Amendment. Before that, it wasn't that governments didn't allow people to have guns or anything like that. It's just that that was considered a state's right. That's something that would be argued out at the state level. Yes, most Americans would have had a gun for hunting purposes alone, let alone self-protection or collecting guns or anything like that. I'm not aware of any states that tried to outlaw guns outright, but it didn't have anything to do with the Second Amendment. So the idea of incorporating the individual rights interpretation really happens more in the 20th century, and that creates a lot more arguments among historians too. One of the learning objectives there asks about, and this is 10.9, asks about the disagreement between, for instance, Saul Cornell, who really believes that the Second Amendment had purely to do with militias and only had to do with militias, and Gladwell, Malcolm, Joyce Lee Malcolm, who favored the idea, who still continues to favor the idea that it includes both the militia and the individual rights interpretation. So her argument for that is that they had on their minds the 1689 English Bill of Rights, which did give individual gun right ownership to everybody, so that governments that were either completely pro-Protestant or Catholic would not then be able to overrun their opposition. So there's a lot of overlap there. Both of them believe that it had to do with militias, but Joyce also believes that it had to do with individual rights as well. And that's how the Supreme Court also interpreted it in 2008, 2009, when we had rare cases where local governments did try to outlaw firearms. One was in the city of Washington, D.C., and in the city of Chicago, and those laws were overturned by the Supreme Court, at which point they then officially incorporated the Second Amendment down to the state level as well, and said that no national government or states can infringe on one's right to gun ownership. They also acknowledged that within that right, there's a considerable amount of leeway for regulation of guns in terms of which kinds you can own and whether you need permits and all that sort of thing. Now, another thing that gets a little confusing, I think, in this chapter is the issue of James Madison and some of the arguments he makes in the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers are now published collectively as essays, and you would definitely dive into them if you took an upper division course in government or history from this period. But they're really, at the time, they were anonymous newspaper editorials that were arguing in favor of a constitution. And a lot of people thought this republicanism could not work, especially on such a large geographic scale. We hadn't had a lot of success stories with democracy. We had, the Greeks really invented it. The founding fathers saw them as too purely democratic. They put too much power in the hands of the people, and that created a lot of chaos, and they got them into a lot of dumb wars and things like that. And then you had the more Republican representative government model developed by the Romans, and that lasted for a couple hundred years, but that gave way to a dictatorship as Rome began to expand more geographically and start taking over other territories. This was a large territory, so you had isolated examples of republicanism in Europe, little city-states here and there that seemed to be pretty successful, but nothing on a really large scale. And a lot of Europeans said it's too vast of an area. There are too many people. There's too much diversity. There are too many different factions in America so that no one faction would ever be able to ever get control over the country. James Madison in the Federalist Papers really turned that argument upside down and said, hey, that's a good thing. We don't want any one faction to get control of the government. And I think that applies today when you think of lobbies. There's one of the more difficult learning objectives there says that, the textbook argues if we must have lobbies, and those are really legal by the First Amendment right to petition the government. When I say lobbies, I mean groups that advocate for causes. A lot of them have offices in Washington, D.C. A lot of them pay politicians a lot of money in so-called campaign donations. But basically, we have a legalized system of bribery in the United States whereby lobbies can bribe politicians to write laws for them. If we're going to have those, and you could make an argument that we'll never get rid of them anyway, we'll never get rid of money in politics, well, we might as well have a lot of them rather than just a few of them. That way they can balance each other out a little bit. That's why we got pro-pollution lobbies coming from the fossil fuel industry, but we also have lobbies coming from the environmental industry like Greenpeace or the Sierra Club, and they can kind of argue it out with each other, and people can decide who they want to give money to so that they can funnel their money into being bribed toward the right politician. Might be a little bit of a stretch, but it's a variation on the idea that James Madison talked about with the diversity of the United States actually being a good thing and preventing any one faction from taking total control and power. Madison also writes a lot in the Federalist Papers about this idea of republicanism as expressed in the Bill of Rights. It's a way to protect minorities from majorities. And we often think of it as a way to protect people from the government. But in a democracy, the government could be defined as a majority of the people. What do I mean by that? So let's say, for instance, that 51% of the people in America were, say, of the Baptist denomination, and they wanted to outlaw all of the religions and make that the official state religion. Well, in a pure democracy, they could do that very thing. But with Bill of Rights set up to protect minorities from the majority on all kinds of issues, that would never happen. And I'm not sure if we remember that about ourselves enough, that when we export our democracy to other countries, like say in the Middle East, then that message is lost. That very thing, that very thing happened in both Egypt and Iraq in the early 21st century. When we overthrew Saddam Hussein in Iraq and created a democracy, it didn't really have those built-in mechanisms to protect minorities from majorities. It was just basically majority rule. They had overthrown the Sunnis, and when the Shiites came in, they disenfranchised the Sunnis. They basically kicked them out of the government, they kicked them out of the military, and then that radicalized them and led to the formation of ISIS and more hardcore terrorist groups. Similar thing in Egypt. You might think, oh, that's a great thing, for Egypt. We would want them to be a democracy. No, we don't really want them to be a democracy, because for one thing, if they're a democracy, they might be more likely to go to war with another ally of ours, Israel. But when they did have a democratic revolution there during the Arab Spring, well, the majority got the power. They did things like turn around and outlaw Christianity and start creating a lot of laws that discriminated against a lot of people. That can happen in a pure democracy. So I want you to think about that when you think about the role of the Bill of Rights. Well, I've used up enough of your time now, but hopefully covering some of these more difficult learning objectives will help you prepare for the second exam. So thank you, and that's it for now.